Between about 1450 and 1750, the world basically went mad for two things: gold and silver. But this wasn't just about a few people getting rich. Oh no, this was a frantic, global scramble that didn't just build empires, it completely redrew the map of the world and forged the modern economy in a fire of greed, faith, and some really surprising creativity. So, the big question we're tackling is this: how did a simple hunt for shiny metals lead to a complete rewiring of, well, everything? We're talking global economies, entire societies, and even what people believed. It's a huge story, so let's dive in.
All right, so where did it all begin? Well, the spark was a simple but incredibly powerful thirst for precious metals. This wasn't just about lining pockets. This was about pure, unadulterated power. What we see happening in this era is a huge shift in how nations thought about power. Before, power was all about land, but now European nations became obsessed with a new idea called mercantilism. And the theory was simple: the most powerful country was the one with the most physical gold and silver in its treasury, period. And that one idea kicked off this insane global race for resources. This obsession with wealth sparked what historians now call the commercial revolution, a total makeover of the global economy. As new sea routes opened up, a flood of gold and silver poured into Europe. But this had a shocking, totally unintended consequence. With so much more money floating around, the prices for everyday stuff went through the roof. This massive inflation got its own name: the price revolution.
Now you can imagine, funding a global empire is incredibly expensive and super risky. So to fuel this revolution, they had to invent new financial tools. They literally needed to create new rules for money that could power these massive overseas adventures.
And the most brilliant invention they came up with was the joint stock company. Seriously, if you've ever heard of the stock market, this is basically its granddaddy. It was a genius idea that allowed regular, middle-class people, not just kings and queens, to invest in these global expeditions by buying shares. So here's the breakdown of how it worked. First, you sell shares to a bunch of investors to raise a ton of cash. Second, the company uses that money to fund a super risky voyage to, say, the Indies. Third, if the ship comes back loaded with treasure, everybody gets a cut of the profits. But Step 4 was the real game changer: limited liability. This meant that if the ship sank, you only lost the money you put in. Your house, your farm, your other assets, they were all safe. This one little innovation made investing way less terrifying and opened the floodgates for people to pour money in.
And this just perfectly shows the huge risks and huge rewards. On one hand, you have the Dutch East India Company. They were a massive success. They used faster ships, dominated the spice trade, and made absolutely obscene amounts of money. But then you look at France and England, and you see these speculative frenzies creating massive economic bubbles that, when they burst, bankrupted thousands of investors. It was a powerful new system for sure, but it was also incredibly volatile.
But all this money, all this demand for profit, it needed one more ingredient to really take off: cheap, and I mean expendable, labor. And that need created something monstrously efficient and unbelievably brutal: the triangular trade.
The cycle started in Europe. Ships would get loaded up with manufactured goods, especially guns and gunpowder, and sail to the coast of Africa. There, those weapons were traded for human beings, which in turn fueled conflicts on the ground and made certain slave-raiding kingdoms, like the Oyo and Dahomey, incredibly powerful.
The second leg of this triangle was the infamous Middle Passage. And here, human beings were treated like cargo. They were packed into the suffocating dark hulls of ships for a journey that lasted months. It was a voyage of unimaginable horror. This wasn't just a trip, it was a floating tomb, a brutal system designed to deliver a terrified workforce. The human cost was just staggering.
And finally, the third leg completed the triangle. All the products of that slave labor, things like sugar, tobacco, and cotton, were shipped from the Americas back to Europe. These goods generated enormous profits, which were then just pumped right back into funding more voyages, locking the whole vicious cycle in place.
The fallout from this new global economy went way beyond just money. It led to the complete erasure of some cultures and the forced rebuilding of others. The cultural consequences were permanent, and they were profound.
This table really gives us a stark look at the consequences. So over in Africa, you see this devastating social impact where population growth was stunted. But notice the strange paradox. Some African kingdoms, like the Oyo, actually grew rich and powerful by participating in the slave trade. Meanwhile, in the Americas, the impact was one of total erasure. Indigenous political systems were just dismantled and replaced by Spanish viceroys, and native cultures were systematically destroyed.
And make no mistake, this was a deliberate act of cultural destruction. The burning of native books, for instance, means that so much of what we know about these amazing civilizations comes from the accounts of their conquerors, the Spanish priests and conquistadors. It's a history literally written by the victors.
Back in Africa, the demographic impact was just as devastating. The slave trade overwhelmingly targeted men. About 2/3 of all captives were male. And when you rip that many men out of a society, it throws everything into chaos. It led directly to major social shifts, like a rise in polygyny, and forced women to step into roles that had traditionally been held by men. But in the middle of all this horror and destruction, something pretty incredible happened. When all these different cultures collided, so did their beliefs, and this led to both conflict and this amazing explosion of religious creativity. The key idea to get your head around here is syncretism. It's basically the fusion of different religious traditions. Think of it like this. When people are forced into totally new environments, they don't just forget their old beliefs. They adapt them. They blend them with new ones to create something completely unique.
And this is where we see just incredible human resilience. Enslaved Africans in the Americas were forced to adopt Catholicism, but they did it on their own terms. They cleverly combined their traditional African faiths with the religion of their captors, often hiding their own gods and spirits behind the masks of Catholic saints. This fusion created these vibrant, powerful new religions like Santeria in Cuba, Vodun in Haiti, and Candomblé in Brazil, all of them rich with African traditions.
And here's a fascinating detail that is so often overlooked. It's estimated that about 10% of the enslaved Africans brought to the Americas were actually Muslim. And that added yet another complex layer to this new religious landscape that was forming.
Now, at the same time, Catholic missionaries were incredibly successful. As you can see from this chart, Roman Catholicism became, and it still is, the dominant religion throughout Latin America. So you really have these two stories happening at once, the creation of these new blended faiths and the widespread adoption of the European one.
But here's the thing. Even within mainstream Catholicism, this blending was unavoidable. Just look at Mexico. The Virgin of Guadalupe, one of the most beloved figures in the entire religion, is often depicted with a darker complexion. This is a clear, beautiful blend of Catholic imagery with indigenous beliefs, and it created a figure that resonated deeply with the local people.
And this quote, it just says it all, really. In the face of the unimaginable trauma of slavery and the deliberate destruction of their cultures, enslaved peoples found ways to hold on to what they remembered. They combined it with their new, brutal reality, and in doing so created powerful and lasting new forms of worship. It's an incredible testament to the resilience of the human spirit. So, we'll leave you with this thought to chew on. The world we've been talking about was built on an obsession with gold and silver. So, what are our modern obsessions? For things like data, or social media influence, or crypto? What forces are fundamentally reshaping our world right now, right under our noses? Thanks for joining us.